So it's a pleasure meeting all of you here today. My name is Mohsen Alayche. I'm a McMaster resident physician currently in my first year. Prior to that, I completed my studies at the University of Ottawa Medical School. And today I shall be summarizing our findings of essentially the reporting best practices of Canadian clinical trials over the past decade. As you all may or may not be aware, over the past few years, there's been more light that's being, more information is being revealed on the prevalence of publication bias across the world. We took it upon ourselves to sort of analyze the Canadian clinical trials in particular, and I look forward to answering all of your questions today. To summarize sort of our presentation, we have a lot of room for improvement, and I'll be showing you why momentarily. So we ended up publishing our paper in Facets, an open access journal. And I would like to, before I get started, thank all of the authors that helped make this project happen, especially Dr. Kelly Kobe, Dr. David Mower. I know some of the co-authors are here joining us today. I see Patricia. It's been a wonderful pleasure working with everyone. And of course, the OHRI, the Center of Journalology from the Ottawa Hospital, and the University of Ottawa. The funding of this paper was in part by the University of Ottawa Medical Summer Studentship Program, but we otherwise have no conflict of interest and no other disclosures. So background, as you're all aware, publication bias leads to the exaggerated benefits of treatment and it underestimates their harms. Now, a very common, or I would say simple example to give is, say a certain researcher is analyzing one intervention, say one medication, and they recruit 100 patients to analyze. And let's just say that halfway through the project, the outcomes aren't as they'd expect, or there are too many side effects or too many adverse effects. The researcher then makes a decision not to publish their findings or not to report their results. Unfortunately, what this leads to is a few years down the road, some other researcher may then reinvestigate that same medication or that same intervention and consequently harm more people. This is one example of how publication bias can be essentially a waste of resources. And as the image depicts here on the right, there is a staggering amount of unpublished data in the research world. And for us here, evidence-based medicine is the cornerstone of guidelines and medical treatments and therapies and the cornerstone of further research. And unfortunately, if we cannot keep the publication bias threshold in check, we cannot validate the integrity of the evidence that's being used in evidence-based medicine. So we try to adhere to study registration and reporting best practices in order to minimize these outliers. And that said, as it's pretty evident by now, a lack of regulation is detrimental to the healthcare system as it wastes resources and puts patients at risk. So as I've seen in some of our previous talks here at the Method series, certain meta-analyses, for example, consists of hundreds of studies that they themselves are filled with a certain amount of bias, therefore making the ultimate sort of conclusion and or guideline skewed and inaccurate. Now, here in Canada, we have also within the past decade, the Tri-Council policy statement, which states that all clinical trials where patients are recruited shall be registered before recruitment of the first trial participant, and that researchers shall promptly update the study registry with their findings. Now, immediately as you're reading this statement, you realize, well, what does promptly update the study really mean? What is promptly? Is it 1 month? Is it 1 year? Is it 10 years? As you can see, it's a bit ambiguous. And furthermore, it doesn't specify what the consequences would be if someone does not adhere to these recommendations. Now, furthermore, they state that sponsors should register their trial in a publicly accessible registry, such as clinicaltrials.gov. Now, you'll see when I present later on what that implies and the limitations of this statement. But once again, it doesn't really specify what would happen otherwise. Are there any legal implications? Are there financial implications? Currently, not really enforced. Now, when we compare that statement from our government with other countries and whether it's the United States or other countries in Europe, you'll see, for example, this is taken directly from the FDA website, that it is a matter of federal law that requires responsible parties to register and submit results to clinicaltrials.gov. Now, there's a lot of literature on clinical trial best practice reporting in the United States. There's also some literature that's present in Europe. We took it upon ourselves to do the same thing, but sort of here in Canada, and have a small comparison. I'm not saying the United States is the best, but it's interesting to compare nonetheless. So for our introduction, for those of you that may not be aware, the World Medical Association in 2008 released the Declaration of Helsinki, and the World Health Organization in 2015 updated their statement on public disclosure of clinical trial results. That is essentially a global attempt to limit publication bias and to ensure that all clinical trials are prospectively registered before patient recruitments. Essentially, what that implies is that before you start recruiting patients, providing them with a certain intervention, you must register in a public registry before, in order for the public or anyone to hold you accountable. Because of course, if someone does not prospectively register their project, they may start recruiting patients, working on a certain intervention, and then based on whatever trends they see, they may then essentially lie and say, this was the purpose of our paper, when in reality, it was something else entirely. So by prospectively registering, it's one variable that we're controlling when it comes to publication bias. The second thing is that all results are to be reported in that registry within 1 year. So the results being reported doesn't necessarily mean you're publishing your findings. There's no discussion here. There's no conclusion. There's no interpretation of your results. It just comes down to, say you recruited 100 patients or 100 participants. Say 20 of them dropped out or had adverse events, or some of them say improved with the treatment. That should be reported in the registry, because once again, you'd be saving time and resources for other researchers in the future. And furthermore, people would be able to validate your results once you publish your paper. As of now, we have countless papers that are published, but the results are nowhere to be found. We cannot reproduce those trials. We cannot validate the data. And lastly, we want to ensure that all findings are being published in a journal regardless of their statistical significance within 2 years. So of course, as someone who also works on clinical trials, I completely understand that we have a huge incentive, many incentives, to publish our paper, especially with positive outcomes or statistically significant outcomes. But ultimately, it's extremely detrimental to the research community when you avoid publishing statistically insignificant findings. And not only that, it's not only the researcher's fault, it's also journals' fault for only accepting statistically significant papers. As you know, this is a much bigger issue. We are just scratching the surface. So the objectives of our paper were to evaluate the adherence of clinical trials in Canada to those registration and reporting best practices. We took it a step further and wanted to identify potential effect modifiers to these best practices. So we wanted to see what variable could accurately or perhaps correlate with successful adherence to those best practices. Maybe it's funding, maybe it's the number of participants, perhaps it's the country where this study was done. We set out to determine this. And the last sort of objective that we have was to create a baseline against which to compare any improvement in Canadian clinical trials in the future. So we analyzed every single trial on clinicaltrials.gov over the past decade. We'll go over the methodology shortly. And ultimately, over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, anyone could repeat our methodology in any country with their own sort of parameters, and they'd be able to compare their results to ours. Now, the way we determine the adherence to publication and reporting best practices is by measuring the following 3 outcomes. So the first one is the proportion of trials that were prospectively registered on clinicaltrials.gov. The second one was the proportion of trials which reported their results on that registry. And lastly, the proportion of trials that published their findings. Now, of course, we must practice what we preach. So our entire protocol, we submitted it and published it on the Open Science Framework prior to our data collection and data analysis. It is all available online and it's been submitted much sooner. All of our data was downloaded from clinicaltrials.gov, which is an open database and it's free. And our preprint was published on medRxiv, also free, open source with all of our results. Now for our methods, as I mentioned, all our data was downloaded from clinicaltrials.gov in an XML format in order to have all the details possible relating to those clinical trials. And our inclusion criteria was that essentially all trials identified must have been, one, registered on clinicaltrials.gov. They must have had at least one Canadian sites where participants or patients were recruited to those trials. They must have been interventional clinical trials, not observational. So in other words, a certain treatment or therapy or medication was provided, some sort of intervention. A start date after 2009 and a completion date before 2019. In total, we identified a grand 6,720 trials, which is a huge sample size. Now for the best part of the presentation, our results. So as I mentioned, we had 6,720 trials identified. Now, of those trials, roughly 48% of them were funded by the industry and 52% were funded by academia, such as universities, etc., industry being pharmaceutical companies and so on and so forth. So over the next few, in this table, we essentially stratified and sorted, filtered all of our trials based on the lead sponsor in this case, and then the number of patients, the phase of the trial, etc. We'll go over it. And those are some of the effect modifiers we set out to analyze. Now, we also stratified them based on the phase of the trial. So here we have all the phases that were identified. And one of the largest proportions were phase 3 trials, about 1,500 of them. And interestingly, 38% of all trials identified didn't report what phase they were in. When it came to the number of participants, in total, we had over 1,000 trials that had more than 500 participants enrolled. And here, as you can see, we had essentially hundreds of thousands of patients that were part of these trials that we analyzed. And now when it comes to the trial site location, 56% of what we identified were clinical trials conducted exclusively in Canada. They had no other recruitment or no other site outside of Canada. And 44% of them, so almost 3,000 of them, had at least one Canadian site and one or more international sites. And lastly, as I mentioned previously, we included all trials that were completed prior to 2019. So we just set out to determine what percentage of papers were completed by what year. And as you'll see, that number is gradually sort of increasing and somewhat stable, just sort of giving us an accurate equal representation. Okay, now that said, as I mentioned earlier, our main 3 outcomes were to determine for all trials identified, all 6,720 trials, what proportion of them were, and this is on the x-axis here, the prospective registration, the percentage that reported their results, that published their findings, and finally, that completed all 3 best practices concurrently. And on the y-axis, we just have the percentages. So for prospective registration, roughly 59% did so, which is not bad, definitely not the best. When it comes to reporting their results in the registry, that number is roughly 39%. In other words, roughly 60% of all identified trials simply didn't report anything in the registry. We could not validate their results. It would be very difficult to reproduce their paper. And in terms of publishing their findings, that number goes up to 56%. Now, mind you, publishing your findings is always an excellent step. However, in the absence of completing all three best practices concurrently, you ultimately are still contributing to that bias to an extent. Because ultimately, someone may prospectively register their paper, never make their results available, and then publish whatever they want, and we'd have no way to verifying the integrity of the data analysis, and so on and so forth. And lastly, the percentage of trials that completed all three best practices concurrently was only 20%. So this is for all identified trials over the past decade. So we told ourselves, all right, so we have that 20%. Now, once again, in this graph, we reanalyze the same three outcomes. So prospective registration, results being reported, publication of findings, but we plotted it over time. So we wanted to see essentially, were there any trends that we could observe from 2009, 2019? So starting with prospective registration, we noticed that from year to year, there's been an increase in the number of papers that are prospectively registering. Now, mind you, this is merely an observation that we're making based on our results. We didn't statistically analyze this. But when it comes to the results being reported in the registry, that number seems somewhat stagnant, perhaps slightly decreasing. But I will bring your attention and just say we have to analyze these graphs carefully because let's just say a paper was completed in 2018 or 2019, and we collected our data in, say, 2021, we would have given those researchers only 1 to 2 years to report their results and publish their findings. Whereas people who completed their paper in 2009 had about 10 years to do so. So just interpret this graph with caution. And now for publishing their findings, you could see an upward trend. And we didn't analyze papers after 2014 because we wanted to give researchers enough time to publish their paper in the first place. We cited literature that demonstrated that essentially in many cases, researchers would require way more than 2 years to publish their findings, sometimes up to 5 years in certain clinical trials. And so it would be unfair to hold researchers that completed their trial in 2019 to the same scrutiny to people who published in 2009. And lastly, when we combined all three best practices, that number seems to be gradually increasing from year to year. In other words, it looks pretty promising. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to see what are the potential effect modifiers to these best practices. So we'll start with the table on the left. And we divided all of our identified trials based on their lead sponsor. So whether they're industry funded and pharmaceutical companies or academia or others essentially, such as universities, etc. Now for industry funded research, that number was 36%. So 36% of clinical trials that had a lead sponsor in the industry adhered to all three best practices. For academia, on the other hand, only 5%. Now, to many of you, that is not a surprise, but once again, it's interesting to reanalyze and publish our findings, sort of demonstrating this bias. Now, of course, we can come up with multiple reasons as to why there's that discrepancy, but it is present nonetheless. When it comes to the clinical trial site on the right-hand side, we divided them by international, meaning at least one Canadian site where patients or participants, were recruited, and Canada only. So research that was exclusively conducted in Canada. So for international trials, roughly 42% of those identified trials were adhering to all three best practices. And in comparison, only 3% of trials exclusively completed in Canada adhere to all three best practices. Now that said, once again, we may justify this by explaining that international trials perhaps have more funding, perhaps those are more likely to be funded by the industry where there is more regulation, and perhaps Canadian trials have smaller participant numbers, and perhaps they're more likely to be less likely to be funded by the industry. Whatever the case may be, it doesn't take away from the fact that participants were part of these trials. They gave up their time and in some cases their health to be part of this trial and this certain intervention. And whatever ended up being published, well, first of all, whether it was published or not, had a component of publication bias in it. And those discrepancies are present in the literature. This is nothing new, but this is new for us here in Canada. Now, two additional effect modifiers we analyzed were the total patient enrollment. So in clinical trials where more than 500 patients, more than 500 participants were recruited, 48% of those trials adhered to all three best practices. That number drops to 27% if you have less patients recruited. And lastly, if you have less than 100 participants, that number is as low as 8%. So once again, we may justify this by saying more patients, therefore more regulation, therefore more funding, a closer eye from the public. But nonetheless, if a clinical trial recruited, say, 10 or 15 patients, you would want to hold them to the same standard regardless, as these people gave part of their time to be part of this trial. When it comes to the phase of the trial, phase 1 trials were as low as 4%. Phase 3 trials, 49%. Once again, this is also present in the literature, interesting nonetheless. And then for all remaining phases, that number is 22%. And as I showed you guys earlier, about 3,000 of the identified trials, if I'm not mistaken, roughly 3,000, simply didn't report what phase they were in. And for those trials, the adherence to all three best practices was 4%. So we just went over 4 effect modifiers, and in all 4 cases, the anticipated sort of trend was observed, as other literature suggests. We also analyzed an additional 6 potential risk modifiers that we have in our appendix and published in our paper. But for the sake of this presentation, we'll stick with those 4. Now, to summarize, the most interesting or significant potential effect modifiers for us here in Canada is that only 3% of clinical trials conducted exclusively in Canada satisfied the reporting best practices over the past decade. Now, ultimately, that number has a significant room for improvement. It is interesting to note nonetheless, and it would be excellent to compare any future improvement to this stat that we've identified today. Now, to summarize, in terms of its statistical significance, amongst trials conducted in Canada, the odds of having adherence to all 3 best practices concurrently is 90% lower in academia than in industry. It is 96% lower in phase 1 trials than in phase 3 trials. It is 91% lower in trials with less than 100 participants than in trials with more than 500 participants. And lastly, it is 95% lower in clinical trials done exclusively in Canada than in international trials. Now, of course, like any other research project, we do have our limitations, and here are 5 of the most glaring ones. The first limitation in our paper that limits sort of our ability to extrapolate or generalize our results furthermore is that we only analyzed one database. So of course, clinicaltrials.gov is arguably the largest database there is, but it does not encompass all clinical trials that were completed in Canada. In fact, the government website recommends whichever public database, and they actually listed a few. The second one is that we only analyzed registered trials. In other words, perhaps some researchers never registered their trial, but they did publish their paper. Those clinical trials were not included in our analysis because we had no way of knowing. And so in theory, we could be overestimating the amount of adherence. So perhaps that 3% that we went over is in reality slightly lower, for all we know. Another limitation is that we only analyze completed trials. In other words, some clinical trials have to essentially stop and are discontinued for multiple reasons. Some could be valid, some reasons are not. But any trial that was not completed did not meet our inclusion criteria, and therefore we didn't analyze it. Now, had we analyzed those papers, our results would have been slightly different. Another major limitation would be that we identified the publication status of those clinical trials by relying on clinicaltrials.gov. They have an automatic sort of function that tells you whether a clinical trial has been published or not. And we realized this as we were working on our paper. So we completed a quality assurance of our stats where we manually reviewed 10% of our data. So roughly 650 trials we manually reviewed by checking Google Scholar, PubMed, and clinicaltrials.gov. And we manually checked whether that paper was published truly or not. And we found out that clinicaltrials.gov actually underestimated the true percentage of publication. So that's a fourth limitation. And lastly, as you may recall, earlier in our presentation, we talked about time frames. So in order for us to have our publication bias levels controlled, the reporting of the results should be done in a timely manner within 12 months, as per the World Health Organization, and the publication of the findings should be done within 2 years. We didn't take into account how much time it took to do so. In other words, if a researcher completed their trial in 2009 and they only reported their results in 2018, almost 9 years later, we simply stated that this is a clinical trial that did report their results and therefore did the right thing. We didn't take into account how long it took and that perhaps they may have published their paper before reporting their results and therefore technically contributing to publication bias. So those are some of the limitations that we've had. Now, as a small update, Dr. Perry shared this email with me about this new CIHR policy here in Canada, which is actually a wonderful step in the right direction. They state that nominated principal investigators receiving CIHR grant funds for clinical trial research must comply with the following practices to remain eligible for any new CIHR funding. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, this includes registering their clinical trial. It includes that the results must be publicly disclosed within 1 year, within 12 months, and that all study publication must include a registration number or trial ID, which is great. They, however, do not say, at least I didn't see when I had a look at it, that the paper has to be completely published within 2 years, as the World Health Organization states. And more interestingly, how will this be enforced? So of course, some principal investigators may not receive future funding if they don't meet these criteria, but what are the other consequences of not adhering to these rules? And furthermore, what if someone isn't applying for CIHR grant funds? Are they also held to the same standard? Would this standardize this process and ensure that any patient in Canada enrolling in any clinical trial should feel safe with this new policy? I'm feeling hopeful. It's definitely an excellent step in the right direction. There's definitely more awareness, but it would be interesting to analyze this in a few years. So in conclusion, there is substantial room for improvement here in Canada. We can learn from other countries and from other places. And ultimately, the data we're presenting today provides as a baseline for any future research in this area so that they could compare their results to ours and sort of hopefully plot an upward trend in improvement. Now, our paper, we had the pleasure and the honor of presenting our abstract at the International Congress on Peer Review and Scientific Publication in Chicago. We also had CTV News cover the results of our paper. And I'm also told that CBC News may be covering something similar tonight when it comes to clinical trials here in Canada and their lack of sort of monitoring and efficiency. But ultimately, as you're all very aware, this is a huge, massive problem that is costing taxpayers millions and millions of dollars, and it's costing researchers and clinicians countless resources to rectify any previous mistakes. And finally, it is costing patients and participants either their time, their health, perhaps some finances, or a combination of all three. And therefore, it's a very important topic that should be studied and analyzed further. That said, I would like to thank you all very much for coming in here today. Please don't hesitate to ask me any question. Feel free to email me at any time. I'd be happy and glad to have a discussion.
Start. So I noticed that you had it looked at any kind of systematic reviews that hadn't registered, or sorry, randomized controls trials that hadn't registered, or any kind of like phase one, phase two trials? Are you planning to do that next? Is that your next step, or what are your future research endeavors?
So future research endeavors entails repeating a very similar methodology, but once again in the future, and just comparing those results to ours because we know intuitively why, for example, the phase of the trial may contribute to this lack of adherence. So phase one trials, you're testing a brand new medication, say an intervention. What are the odds it'll be very successful or not have adverse effects or be statistically significant? When you compare that to, say, phase three trials, which are on the verge of being available to the public, on the verge of potentially making millions of dollars, and so I don't necessarily expect that trend to change when we're analyzing phase as a potential modifier. But we're hoping that the rate of this adherence would hopefully increase from year to year.
Great. And are you thinking about taking a look at those trials that haven't been registered, like doing like a random sample and then kind of going through and seeing what has been registered, what hasn't?
Absolutely. And honestly, if we do so, we would demonstrate that we're actually overestimating the overall reporting. Like all the
Yeah.
numbers that we've come up with today are very generous numbers. If we include all the papers that weren't registered and just randomly published in a journal somewhere, those numbers would be much lower.
Great. Yeah, we have another question too. So, any idea how Canada compares with other countries, or I guess other regions too, right? Like the EU, or yeah. I might have missed the beginning of the presentation though.
Yes. So excellent question. So when we compared our exclusive Canadian clinical trials, that number was staggeringly low, sitting at 3%. And as soon as you introduced one additional country, whether it was the United States or say anywhere in Europe or in Asia, etc., that number jumped up to 42%. Now, what we haven't done is independently only analyze United States clinical trials exclusively. We only did that for Canada. It would be very interesting, however, for other researchers to repeat the same methodology in their country, and then we can compare one country to the next. I know someone in Australia, perhaps, is currently working on something similar, but it would be interesting nonetheless.
Great, thank you. I also had another thought too. So a lot of like, I know you went through risk factors, right? And a lot of your risk factors for why studies, I guess, would not be registered or would be registered. And I think a lot of those factors tend to feed into this test, right, for publication bias. When you test for publication bias, you're testing to see if a study is published or not published within the context of a specific PICO criteria of your systematic review. However, like that test for publication bias has strong assumptions about how trials are either registered, not registered. And I was wondering if you had plans to maybe, yeah, do a new sort of publication bias test based on the assumptions that you've like looked at in your study.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And not only that, not only would the, say, PICO question or whether or not their intentions or outcomes have remained the same, but it's also whether or not the study itself is reproducible and or valid, right? Someone may come in and say, our goal, our outcome is XYZ. Here's our PICO criteria. We did report our results. We did publish our paper. But now the second level would be to redo their math, reanalyze their data, reinterpret their results, and then verify that they sort of came up with the correct conclusion. All of those sort of criteria need to be met for us to adequately say this paper is free of any bias. We are currently scraping the surface. This is the absolute bare minimum. And we are also giving them the benefit of the doubt. We're not even holding them accountable in terms of timeline. We're saying as long as you publish within the next decade, you're fine, but at least publish. You see what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, we have a few more comments that have come in. I think it's Ismail who says that it's interesting to know that the 36% adherence from industry versus the 5% in academia is because the industry has to report to their stakeholders and not because they are quote unquote better. I mean, besides that, the industry probably has more funds.
Absolutely. And that's a huge problem from the academia point of view. Why are trials that are registered or part of the industry held to a higher standard? Of course, one may argue there are more lawsuits, there's more money, as you mentioned correctly. But does that mean, say a patient or a certain participant at a hospital or at a clinic is enrolling in any study funded by, say, a random university? Why are they held to a lower standard? There's nothing wrong with what the industry is doing in that regard. Of course, the industry may be doing other unethical things that we can explore at another presentation. Our point is to try to increase the academic and academia point of view to also hold those people accountable. And this sort of ties in with Edward's question, sorry, on why Canada has much lower adherence compared to other countries. Perhaps because we don't have any laws or strict rules or any calling out of any institute or individual or whoever that may not be
Yeah.
doing so. When we compare to other countries such as the United States, where the consequences are massive, once again, I don't know how well enforced it is in the United States, but they have fines, they have federal law getting involved, perhaps much stronger lawsuits, whereas here that may not be the case.
Yeah. And then we have a question from Tom who says, do you think there's an opportunity to present for you at any meetings of Canadian clinical investigators like the Royal College of Physicians or the major clinical societies such as the Canadian Cardiological Society, Respiratory, Geriatrics, etc.?
Absolutely. It would be an honor and a pleasure for me to do so. And in fact, we can also maybe one day reproduce our paper with the same methodology. And rather than stratify them based on like phase of the trial or funding of the trial, we can also stratify them based on the type of medical field that it was published in. But once again, we have to ask ourselves, like, how much more information are we getting out of this? Like, perhaps, let's just say cardiology research is much more rigorous and has a very low rate of publication bias because they have so much more funding and more patients, say, than a rheumatology association or rheumatology papers. It would be interesting. Ultimately, my goal here as a Canadian and a future practicing physician here in Canada is to increase our standards so that we are the absolute leading world people, publishers in the world. And other countries should ideally be learning from us, and patients and participants should feel extremely safe and comfortable knowing if I'm at a hospital or a clinic or at home in Canada and I'm being recruited into a trial, I shouldn't be worried like other people in other countries where no one is being held accountable, no one is verifying whether their paper or research is valid or reproducible or not.
Great. Guillaume asks, is there any idea if the publication status was correlated with the sample size in your study? I think you did go over that in the at the beginning.
Yes, excellent question. And as you can see here, yes, it was absolutely. So the larger the paper, the more people that were enrolled in a certain study, the higher the prevalence of, the higher, yeah, prevalence of adherence to those best practices. And then the smaller the paper, the less likely they were to adhere to all best practices. And once again, as we've mentioned before, we have many reasons that explains this discrepancy, but it doesn't take away from a patient's point of view or from a researcher or clinician's point of view that ultimately when you're reading a paper or when a paper is part of a meta-analysis, you want to assume that those papers are free of any bias. So despite this justification we may come up with, ideally it shouldn't be there.
Are there any other questions? So I think Ismail says, thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative and looking forward to seeing how this changes in the future and comparing it to academia field in Sweden. So I was thinking actually how if we wanted to change like, lobby Health Canada, federally to make changes to these laws similar to I guess maybe what would be happening in the UK or the United States, how could we do that as, as academics or even as consumers of health research?
I would say the CIHR is starting off very well by updating their statement. It's a wonderful step in the right direction. The next one would be awareness for those policymakers. So we've identified so many trials. There are thousands and thousands of patients that were or participants that were part of these trials. When they also start speaking out, like, "Hey, I've had this intervention in the past. Has my data been used properly, or have these researchers just done whatever they wanted with it?" This outcry will motivate those policymakers to regulate this and learn from other countries that are outperforming us. And ultimately, when others will compare their stats to ours, hopefully with the CIHR's involvement and whether it's provincial or federal laws, if that's what's required, we would be the ones leading in this domain.
Yeah, great. Do you know of any like advocacy organizations, nonprofits that are kind of trying to spearhead this type of thing that we could actually go to and get involved with?
I mean, there's you guys, of course. Other than here, I'm sure there are some. We at the University of Ottawa, we created an interest group where we invited some senators and politicians to come into our med school and just sort of talk about this discrepancy to an extent. And yeah, it's a widespread problem. Significant room for improvement.
Thank you. Great. I think Chiprian, you were saying that there's a show that's going to be airing tonight on clinical trials. Can you tell us a bit about that?
That's right. It's an investigative documentary that will air tonight on the Passionate Eye on CBC and also will be available on CBC Gem. I think it's called Bodies for Rent. And it examines kind of abusive practices in the clinical trial industry. Uh, it probably will be quite shocking to see in Canada. So it's specific to Canada.
Yeah, Bodies for Rent is the name of the documentary. So you could probably just, if you wanted to search it online, just go to cbc.ca and type in Bodies for Rent. So yeah, it should be interesting. I heard a clip about it yesterday and when I was driving my car. I was listening to CBC in my car, so that came up. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. That's 9 p.m. today. That's I think 9 p.m. throughout. Is that British Columbia time, Ciprian?
I think it will be throughout the country, so local time
Oh,
wherever
throughout the
you
country.
are.
There you go.
Mhm.
Okay, we got another question. So I'm wondering, this is Armini who says, I'm wondering whether this presentation has been communicated recently which CDA conference pursuing change and opportunity in collaborative research.
Not yet, but we definitely would love to disseminate our findings to as many people as we can. And please feel free to share our findings, our paper, with whoever. And we are all very strong believers and advocates for transparency. So all of our results, all of our paper, our protocol are 100% available and reproducible. So it would be excellent to get in touch with them. Absolutely.
Great. All right. Well, if that's the end, then thank you so much again, Dr. Alayche, for joining us today. Super interesting presentation, and I really hope Canadian academics get more on board with registration and publishing.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor, and it was wonderful meeting everyone here and answering all everyone's questions. Thank you so much.